Internet, and welcome to the Collective Arcana. We're a channel all about tabletop gaming, and today we're going to talk a little bit about spellcasting in Pathfinder 2nd Edition. The reason for this video is because we're in the middle of doing a bunch of class videos, and rather than going over everything about spellcasting on one particular video, the first spellcasting video we have, which is Bard, which is quite delayed and coming up soon, we decided to just do one video on spellcast and just sort of cover the basics. We're not going to go too in-depth nitty-gritty here, but we do want to have something that we can refer back to if you're trying to figure out what's it like to be a druid, and we're talking about being a prepared spellcaster and things like that. Something that we can refer you back to rather than having to go full in-depth on each individual class. So everything we're going to be covering here is going to be really generic, really specific. There's going to be a lot of you in the comments probably pointing out, oh, well, no, you can, spontaneous spellcasters can heighten, blah, blah, blah. We're going to keep everything that is outside of the normal rules. That is a class feature, even if it's a shared class feature, like a signature spell. We're going to, not have these in this video. We're going to talk about them in the individual class video. Again, just to make sure that the most pertinent information is only have to go over it once for a particular video. In Pathfinder 2nd Edition, there are 4 spellcasting traditions. Rather than each class having its own curated particular spell list, what the designers have done over at Paizo is they have created 4 fairly different spell lists. Some spells do repeat across each. Most spells, in fact, will appear on at least 2 spell lists. Some will appear on all or nearly all, and then some are unique to each spell list. What that means is that you don't have to worry about, oh, I really like the Oracle, but I want to make sure that my Oracle is going to be able to do all the same things that a cleric could do in terms of spell selection. Now, there are some classes and some class abilities that will give you access to spells not normally on your list. So if you like the idea of having options that others don't worry. There is still some of that, and we'll get into, in addition to just adding spells to your list that aren't normally there, we're going to get into the various different types of spells that you can get from class abilities and things like that are going to give you even more unique options over the standard for your class. So there is the arcane tradition, and that's going to go with wizards. That's going to be your traditional, when most people think of D&D spellcasting or Pathfinder spellcasting, they're thinking of that. The other that you're thinking of is divine, and that's what clerics use. But in addition to those, Pathfinder 2nd Edition and Paizo have added occult, which is the purview of the bard. And that is a little more sort of esoteric, almost, occultism type of spells. So a little bit of healing and support and things, but then also, divination, the sort of things you would expect a bard to be able to do, honestly. And then there's the primal spell list, and that's most associated right now with druids. They are the de facto primal spellcasters, and that's going to be a spell list composed primarily of elemental, mostly damage spells, a lot of big booms. For people that love nature, druids are really good at blowing it up. And then it's also going to have some, weather control and a little bit of, environmental control type things as well. So within those traditions, all spells fall into one of 7 schools. For the most part, spell school doesn't really matter outside of trying to identify the type of spell that you're seeing, getting clues that way. But there are some abilities right now that do play into the spell schools a little bit, and there will be, I'm sure, more as they go. So abjuration, that's going to be protection and wards. Then there's going to be conjuration, and that is summoning, teleporting, jumping across planes, even creating minor temporary objects. Divination, that's the ability to see into the past, present, or future, remote viewing, things like that. Enchantment affects creatures' minds and emotions. Evocation is creating and capturing and then manipulating elemental energies Says most of your elemental damaging spells are going to be evocation, as well as things like dancing lights. Illusion is fooling the senses, whether that's sight, taste, sound, whatever. It's if you want something to seem like something other than what it is, that's most likely an illusion. Then you have necromancy, and necromancy had a pretty big change in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, where they really steered into the idea that healing is a type of necromancy. And that adds, in addition to just making a lot of sense, that also adds some fun role-play elements that you might play with, where, this idea of, there are organizations that think any type of necromancy is bad, including healing, and what does that look like? Finally, you have transmutation. That's turning one thing into another, whether it's lead to gold or flesh to stone, so your transmutation effects, anything changing the nature of a material or a creature. To cast these spells, you use spell slots, and each class will give you a set number of spell slots that will increase as you gain levels. There are some ways to gain additional spell slots outside of those standards granted by your class and levels, but again, those will be in particular class videos talking about the options that you have within that class. Each class must fill their spell slots with spells, and whether you do that in the morning as part of your preparation or throughout your day as you need them, that's going to be dependent on the type of spellcaster you are. Are you a prepared spellcaster? That is, you're setting everything up all at once in the morning, or, whenever you do your preparation. Or are you a spontaneous spellcaster who actually matches those spell slots and spells up on the fly as they need them? Prepared casters are going to assign their spells to spell slots at the beginning of the day. What that means is that day to day, every day, you can have a whole different spell list. It means that, just because you don't have a solution to a problem on Tuesday, you can go and you can rest, and on Wednesday, you can have a solution to that problem. Granted, not all situations are going to allow you to take a day to sleep on it, but when you can, that's a real measurable amount of power that you have, where you can solve those problems, not today, but tomorrow. And one thing that prepared spellcasters can do is, once you know a spell, you know every version of that spell. So, if you know the version of teleport that takes you 100 miles, great. You also, when you're high enough level to cast it, you will also be able to cast the version of teleport that can take you to another planet. So that's really cool and that's really great. The downside there to being a prepared caster is, if you didn't expect to need 3 fireballs that day, and you really want another fireball, but you only prepared, 1 or 2 fireballs, unfortunately, you are out of luck for fireballs. You've got to find, within your prepared spells for that day, another solution to that problem. Which is mostly probably going to be okay. At lower levels, that can be really difficult, but at higher levels, you're generally going to have, hopefully built your spell list in a way that you have other options. So if the prepared caster is versatile, from day to day, what does that make the spontaneous caster? That makes the spontaneous caster versatile from round to round. Because what a spontaneous caster does is they actually get to assign their spells to spell slots in the moment that they cast them. They can't just do this however they want. They, unlike a prepared caster, they only know the different versions of a spell if they've specifically learned the different versions. So while you may know Fireball at 3rd level, you cannot cast a heightened version of Fireball at 5th level unless you also learn that version of Fireball. It doesn't sound like that big of a deal, except that you, as a spontaneous caster, you're probably only ever going to know about 40 spells, because you only know 1 spell per spell slot that you have access to. So when you start learning multiple versions of the same spell, you're eating a huge chunk of the spells that you have access to at all to have different versions of this spell. However, unlike a prepared spellcaster, you don't have to know ahead of time or try to guess how many fireballs you need that day. If you know Fireball and you have 4 3rd level spell slots, you don't have to worry about how many times am I going to want Fireball. As long as you've got a spell slot remaining, you can cast Fireball. So that's really good and that's really nice. It means that most spontaneous spellcasters are going to feel like they don't have as much bookkeeping, and you're going to feel a lot less like you're making decisions that you regret later on. One thing to note with a spontaneous spellcaster is that you can only know a heightened version of a spell. You're totally able to do that. So, if you don't expect to need the 3rd level version of Fireball and you have access to 5th level spells and you want to get the most Fireball for your buck, then you can only cast it at 5th level. Whereas, you're giving up the ability to cast it with a lower level spell slot. So if you used all your 5th level spells for Dimensional Door, now you're out of luck. But that's the give and take there. So, which is better? That's really going to come down to your preferences. There's a lot to be said about both types of spellcasting. I tend to prefer prepared spellcasters, and it used to be they were a lot stronger. My wife's giving me the thumbs down. She likes spontaneous. I think that Pathfinder 2nd Edition has done a really good job of equalizing the power balance, whereas prepared used to really be a lot stronger overall. Now the balance is quite a bit better there. So when we were talking about prepared and versus spontaneous, we talked a lot about the different powered versions of spells, and that's this concept that Pathfinder uses called heightened spells. And as we said, for prepared spellcaster only needs to know one version of a spell, and then when they're doing the preparations in the morning, they can slot that spell into any spell slot that they have access to. So, you can have a stronger version of a spell, or if you don't think you're going to need to use your biggest level spell for that, you can have it at a lower level. Some spells will just get extra damage. Some spells might have additional targets or range or any number of variables when you heighten. And some spells may not heighten at all. Some spells may add a whole new options and uses to themselves when they heighten. It really just depends. Check your spell descriptions and see. And some spells won't even heighten every level. Some will only heighten every 2nd or 3rd level, or have only one heightened version. There's a 2nd level version of the spell and a 5th level version of the spell, and then that's it. And prepared casters can choose which version of a spell they think they're going to want to use that day. Whereas spontaneous casters, as I said, do not have the option to heighten any spell that they know. They only know the base version of it. Again, we'll talk in the individual class videos how the spontaneous casters can get around that limitation to some degree. But for the most part, that is a universal truth with spontaneous casters. So in addition to the spells that you use your spell slots for, Pathfinder 2nd Edition has a few other types of spells that you can cast that are not reliant on those spell slots. The first of which that we're going to talk about is the cantrip. So cantrips are weaker spells that you get access to, and they automatically will heighten to the highest level spell you can cast, which is typically going to be half your level rounded up. But a good way to remember that is I can cast 3rd level spells. It's my best level spell. My cantrips will heighten up to 3rd level. Not all cantrips will heighten. Not all cantrips will heighten the same. They're just like regular spells that way, where they can vary widely, for everything from the number of actions they take to how you heighten them. What's different about cantrips is they are unlimited use. Yes, they're weaker, but you can use them as often as you need. The other thing that's different about cantrips is that they work the same for both prepared and spontaneous casters. You're always going to be casting two spellcasters, a wizard and a sorcerer, both casting, Produce Flame, are both going to be doing the same amount of damage, having the same number of rules, unless they've taken other class options or items that might affect those. But the one edge that prepared spellcasters have over spontaneous spellcasters here is that a prepared spellcaster might know every possible cantrip, whereas the sorcerer or the spontaneous caster has only learned a few, and that's all they ever have access to. A prepared caster gets this big list, and just like with their normal spells, they get to decide which cantrips am I bringing with me today. in addition to cantrips, and working in some ways like cantrips, are focus spells. Focus spells are these unique spells that you get typically as part of your class, but there's a lot of different ways to get them, that give you focus pool, which is a universal pool. So no matter where you got your focus points and where you got your focus spells, they all use that same focus pool. And that focus pool is going to be minimum 1 as long as you have at least 1 focus spell, up to a maximum, no matter how many focus spells, no matter how many ways you got there, a maximum of 3. What's cool about that pool is that no matter where you got those spells, you don't have to keep track of which point came from where. It's all the same pool. It's all universal. You can use them however you want. The other thing that's cool about that pool is that while that's 3 per day maybe, there are ways to recover or recharge those. If you're a champion or a cleric, praying to your deity might be enough to recharge that. If you're a monk, sitting down and meditating might be enough to get those points back. Being a druid, just sitting with your toes in the sand on the beach might be all you need to do. It really varies class to class and source to source for how you recover those focus points. So what are focus spells? Well, like cantrips, they automatically heighten to half your level rounded up. Generally, I'm sure there might be variations down the line that heighten differently, but so far every way that you get access to spells is going to have them be half your level rounded up. Some classes, like the monk and the champion, don't get spells, but they still get focus spells. The Advanced Player's Guide is going to introduce focus spells for at least the monk, or at least the ranger, potentially the rogue as well. We're not 100% sure. But yeah, so that means that these are completely outside of your spell list, and indeed you don't have to have a spell list or spell slots to have access to focus spells. What they are is just slightly, sometimes significantly better cantrips, but rather than being unlimited, they're on a smaller pool that is recoverable. The idea is so you've got something better than a cantrip that as long as you can rest 10 minutes between combats, you can do at least once a combat. Most of the time, these are going to be pretty thematic based on your character choices and your build, whereas the spells in your spell list are wide open to that tradition, so it might be shared amongst many classes. Focus spells are, as far as I've seen, no 2 classes or options are going to give you the same focus spell, which is very cool, and that's how they're getting around the feeling of limitation of having set spell lists for each tradition instead of individual for each class. Another type of spell that Pathfinder 2nd Edition has is the ritual. So rituals are very cool because they are these usually very powerful effects, much more powerful than a spell, at the cost of taking minutes, sometimes hours, sometimes a day or multiple days. I'm sure there's some that take multiple days. And as far as I've seen, they all need a buddy, at least one assistant. So whereas most of the time you're casting a spell, it's all you. With a ritual, you might need multiple people, all making skill checks to keep up with you and get everything to succeed. One of the examples they gave is Victor Frankenstein trying to bring his monster to life, and then if your assistant botches a roll to assist, they might get you the abnormal brain and have it, and now you still succeeded because Dr. Frankenstein succeeded at his check to create the monster, but the assistant failed at their check. So rather than get this obedient great example of modern science, you have this basically this wrecking machine that is going to go all haywire and not do anything you want it to do. So it still worked, but there's a caveat. And most rituals work that way. They might also completely fail if the primary person performing the ritual fails their check. Each ritual will describe what it can and cannot do and what can go wrong there. What's really cool about rituals is you don't have to be a spellcaster to have them. Just like how some classes will give access to focus points that don't normally get spells, but you can still get focus points. Literally anybody can get access to rituals. You have to, learn it somehow. They're usually not things that you get by level up or anything. They're things that you're going to get through story. Your game master is going to give those to you. But that means that the rogue might know the ritual. It means that the barbarian, maybe his clan knew how to, do X, Y, Z, and they have the ritual about it. So it's your barbarian who is going to come in and lead this ritual. And that's a really, really fun thing. And it's a really cool thing. Of course, spellcasters can learn rituals, and oftentimes they're going to be very good at it, because the majority of rituals, their primary check is going to be one of the 4 tradition skills. So Arcana for arcane, religion for divine, nature for primal, and occultism for occult spells. So, spellcasters are usually going to be the best at rituals, but they don't get full control. They're not the only ones who have access, which is very interesting and very cool, especially given how powerful those rituals tend to be. The last version of spells that I could think of, I'm sure I missed one, definitely let me know in the comments, but the last version are innate spells. So some classes, usually an ancestry or a heritage, will give you an innate spell. Some skill feats as well, like Arcane Eye. So some skill feats as well will give them to you. And they are spells that you can do usually a very limited number of times, most of the time once. But I think some like cantrips and things that you can get multiple times. And it's usually at a set level. Sometimes they will, the text that is of whatever ability is giving you the innate spell will also list, that if you get any heightened version of it, but you don't automatically heighten or anything like that, like a cantrip or a focus spell. It's usually a set version of the spell that you can do a set number of times per day. These are usually going to be really thematic to your character. It's an option that you elected to take, and it's going to be something that is just a unique thing to have in your back pocket for, strange situations where that's the best thing to do. You've got it. So when you actually cast a spell, whether it is a ritual, a cantrip, using your spell slots, an innate spell, whatever, you're going to be looking at the spell description. And the spell description is going to give you everything you need to know about that spell and how to cast it, what casting that spell does, and what it doesn't do. So it's going to tell you the cast time or number of actions that it takes. It's going to tell you the duration, that's how long the spell lasts. It's going to tell you the range, the number of targets. It's going to tell you the magical school. It's also going to give you any miscellaneous traits, that might interact with yours or, an enemy's traits, things like that. Like if you have, for example, some creatures are immune to any spell that has a mind-affecting trait. So, they're completely mindless, so they don't have to worry about it, even though, most things are going to be not wanting to be affected by that spell. Some things might be completely immune based on those traits that the creature or the spell has. Traits are big in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, not just for spells. You should really, have some idea of what traits are on what abilities you're using, just so that you don't get caught up and surprised by a strange interaction. In addition to all that, the spell is going to break down exactly what happens when you cast it, right down to and including the effects on the degrees of success. And so that's degrees of success, whether it's an enemy rolling a save against it, if they critically succeed, or if you are rolling an attack and you critically succeed or critically fail. So when you cast a spell, it's going to have different components. A spell will usually have a number of components equal to the number of actions that it takes. There are exceptions, but that's a good guiding rule. So why do these components matter? Well, they matter both descriptively, in terms of setting the scene and describing what it's like when you're casting the spell. They also matter in terms of you might need particular items. And they might matter because they might affect how others can perceive and what they can do when they notice you doing these things. So a material component, that's if you have to get a reagent, like out of a material component pouch. Maybe you need an owl's feather to get this spell to work, and then the owl's feather is destroyed. There's focuses, which are like material components, but instead of a disposable item, it's something more powerful, like a cleric's holy symbol of their deity, for example. But otherwise, you're still reaching for this item and using it in your hand. Then there's semantic, and that is, gestures and things like that, motions that you have to make. And then there's verbal, and that's, speaking clearly, somewhat loudly with your voice, using words of power. So everything except verbal has the manipulate trait. And with the manipulate trait, what happens is that, you are in some way focusing on something other than what's immediately in front of you. And that means that you are susceptible to attacks of opportunity and other similar reactions. They will all be unique in triggers, of course, but attack of opportunity is the most common one probably, and it is set off by any manipulate action. So, maybe you just have a verbal though. That's not so bad. Doesn't provoke an attack of opportunity. The problem is most spells are going to have at least 2 components. They usually have 2 actions. And the problem with a verbal is the hardest of the magical components to hide. So if you're trying to cast a spell without anyone noticing, and you have to, shout forense really loud, people are probably going to notice that you're casting a spell. Okay? And if they do notice that you're casting a spell, well, who cares, right? Well, they might be able to identify that spell. You can identify any spell that you have prepared, if you're a prepared spellcaster at that moment, or if you have it in your spell list and you're a spontaneous spellcaster. So it's not your spell list, but in your spell repertoire, the list of spells that you have access to. You will automatically recognize any spell that you see as long as it meets those conditions. If you don't have it prepared and it's not in your spell repertoire, then you can use an action on your turn. Some skills will allow you to do this as a reaction to try to identify the spell with a recall knowledge check. What good is noticing it? Well, some skills and class abilities might give you a bonus on your defenses against a spell that you know or recognize. Or you might be in a situation where you're trying to counteract a spell, either through the counterspell feat that many spellcasters get access to, or maybe through a spell like the actual dispel or remove curse, whatever it is, you want to figure out what you're dealing with so that you can try to negate it, counteract it. A counteract check is typically going to be your spell attack roll against either the caster's spell DC, or you might run into a situation where if it's a monster creating the effect, or an environmental effect, then it might have a special DC that the DM is aware of, or the game master is aware of. So, but yeah, so sometimes you want to counter a spell. And then if you critically succeed to counter, you can counter any spell up to 3 levels, I believe, higher than the spell you used to counter. If you just regularly succeed, not critically succeed, then you can counter a spell up to 1 spell level higher. If you fail the counteract, then you can counter a spell that is lower level than the spell you're using to counter. And then if you critically fail, you can't counter anything. So it's definitely risky. It's not a guarantee, but sometimes, trying anything, even losing a spell slot to try to counter a spell, might be better than just letting it go off. The other way you might cast a spell is through a magic item, whether it's, a scroll or a wand or even a magic staff. Using a magic item to cast a spell, it has to be on your spell list. There are ways around that, things like trick magic item, where you can, where you can basically pretend as if it is on your spell list and you can cast it whether it is or isn't. Wands can be used to cast a single spell once per day. Scrolls are the same way, except that a scroll is disposable. Once it's used, it's gone forever. But what's cool about a scroll is a wizard can learn spells from it, or a witch, so that's very neat. Wands can be used again. However, you have to roll a DC 20 with no modifier, or you have to roll a D20 with no modifiers, and you have to get a 10 or better, or that wand is destroyed. And that's no fun. Nobody wants that. I don't recommend you try that. But if you're in a pinch, if you don't see another way out of a situation besides using that wand a second time today, at least it's an option. Staffs are a lot like wands, except instead of having a single spell that you have access to, a staff is going to store several spells. Staves are, as part of your preparations, they'll get a certain number of charges. Higher level spells may use more charges than lower level spells. Otherwise, casting a spell from a staff or a wand or a scroll is no different rules-wise to casting it as if it was you were using a spell slot. There is a difference here between spontaneous and prepared casters. A spontaneous caster, if a staff is out of charges or you just don't have enough charges to use the spell that you want to cast, you can burn your own spells to cast spells that are in the staff, and that's very cool. A prepared spellcaster can actually sacrifice spells in the beginning of their day to add more points to a staff to use throughout the day. So in both ways, a spontaneous and a prepared spellcaster can get even more oomph out of a staff than is normal. What's cool about staves is they don't blow up if they're out of uses. They do become, somewhat useless, but, once they're out of charges, unless they have cantrips attached to them or something like that. But so they're really the be-all, end-all for power and versatility for your spellcasters. So as I mentioned at the beginning of this video, every class is going to have some ways that break these rules that we've discussed. Again, this video was just meant so that we can refer back to it in the other videos to say, if you're not sure what this ability is giving you, go back and watch this video, rather than having to break down from the ground up on every single spellcaster video. Next on our list is the Bard, which is a spontaneous spellcaster. So we're going to talk about some of those ways that some spontaneous casters, all spontaneous casters up to this point released, but it's not a guarantee, have ways to get around their restricted rules on heightening. Hope you've learned something. Hope this wasn't just too much rambling. I am sure I left a lot out. Those of you that are experts, if there's anything else that you really think that people should know, definitely down in the comments. Let me know if I missed something, if I got something wrong. Of course, that does happen. Or if there's just anything that you think could be added to this Basics of Spellcasting in Pathfinder 2nd Edition video. Your likes, your comments, your support, all that, we really appreciate it. It really helps out the channel and allows us, motivates us to keep making more content for you. So thanks so much for hanging out. This has been the Basics of Spellcasting, and welcome to the collective, and we'll see you next time. Bye.